But welcome everybody again to Curious Conversations. Fantastic to have you, Brad. Thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to what you've got to talk to us about today. And so the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to address you. It's a little bit strange for me because I'm a performer, so I'm used to seeing the whites of the eyes of the people that I'm addressing, whereas the only person I can actually see on stage is Stephen and the lovely poster behind him. So it'll be a little bit abstract for me, but I hope that you enjoy what I have to say. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my history first, so you understand better where I'm coming from. I am just entering my second year as General Director of New Zealand Opera. But as you will tell from my accent, I spent most of the last 40 years in the UK. I actually did grow up in Wellington as a child and went to St Paul's School, St Mark's School, for the beginning of my primary schooling, and it's where I began to play violin as well as a 4-year-old. So Wellington goes way back in my past. But I grew up in Sydney and finished my education in the UK, and then met a girl, got stuck. 40 years later, I was invited back to New Zealand Opera to conduct Verdi's Macbeth in 2022 for the company. And at that point, my predecessor announced that he was leaving. So the conversation began about me succeeding him. I'm delighted to be in New Zealand, and I'm honoured to be the leader of New Zealand Opera for a couple of specific reasons. The opera industry, as we like to call it, is in a bit of crisis worldwide at the moment, and there are problems with falling audiences, falling revenue, and questions about the relevance of opera as an art form to society. These are all very live issues for us. Of course, New Zealand is a small country with a cultured population, but no, if you like, indigenous history of opera making. It's always been seen as an import. And so that raises some big strategic questions for us. I'll talk in a little bit more detail about what opera is, and by extension, what an opera company is, for a little while. And then I'd like to touch on some issues around accessibility, because they are connected for us here at New Zealand Opera. So first of all, what is opera? And I'm not going back to basics here. I'm saying everyone knows what opera is. It's big frocks, glitzy big shows, big orchestra, big chorus, loads of emotion. Someone probably dies, and it's a lovely night out. Well, actually, that is the traditional way of thinking about opera. But in some ways, that's exactly the model that is getting the industry into a little bit of trouble at the moment. That is in retaining audiences, because around us, the other art forms, film, theatre, literature, outdoor spectacles of all kinds, but most notably streaming entertainment, has accelerated in leaps and bounds, not only in the way of the diversity of the content that it offers, but also the way in which it engages with its audiences. And it's discovering new audiences and neglecting others. It's a very, very dynamic media landscape for anyone who is serving content, if you like. And that's what we do. We serve operatic content. What's the content that we're serving? Is it all 19th century Italian opera? That's part of the repertoire that I really love. But there are signs at the major opera houses around the world that it's exactly that kind of content which is attracting fewer and fewer audiences. Which raises a wider question: is opera a museum culture? That is it our responsibility to safeguard the heritage of this art form and not to worry about contemporary art, contemporary opera composition? I don't believe that is our responsibility. I think as the National Opera Company for Aotearoa, we really need to try and cover as many bases as we can in terms of content, but also in terms of audience reach, with what is clearly a very limited budget. We struggle year on year to make ends meet, much less to do the kind of spectacular shows that you might be used to seeing on TV from New York and the Met. So I think it's not a museum culture. If we make it a museum culture, we restrict ourselves to a very small audience who see it as an elite art form. And for me, it's not elite. In fact, my definition of opera is it is stories told through the power of the singing human voice. That for me is the most essential definition of opera that I can come up with. And that takes it a long way away from the frocks and the drama and the scale. It's to do with the clarity, the honesty, and the power of the storytelling. And the fact that it is mediated through the human singing voice, importantly, ideally, in an unamplified form. So there is a big personal history for all of us in this. The first music we hear is probably our mothers singing lullabies to us. They are effectively miniature stories, and I can talk a little bit more in a few moments about our lullaby project. We have a project which is about creating lullabies with young mothers in Tamaki Makaurau. But the lullaby is the first thing that we hear. It's where we begin to understand that music and story can be related and that they're sung by the voice. For me, all of opera's history and its development is just an expression of that very basic principle. And the reason I hold to that definition is because I think it allows for a company like us to be much more flexible about the kind of material, the kind of productions, the kind of operas that we can offer. But also it makes it something which is not about necessarily music from Europe or opera from Europe. For me, it's a little bit like rugby. Rugby began as a European sport, a rather privileged European sport. But over the course of its history, it's become a world sport. And I think I'm safe in saying that New Zealand performs at a level equal to or higher than the rest of the world. That's the vision that I dream of for opera here. For me also, opera began as an explicitly European art form. But Europe doesn't own it. And there is a future for opera that is beyond this heritage canopy of European opera. And for me, it's incumbent on us as the national company to think hard and to try to throw lines out into the future as to what that opera might look like. Now, importantly for me, that doesn't mean avant-garde, inaccessible music. It means always going back to the core, to the germ of what opera is, which is telling stories through the power of the human singing voice. But we have to find local creators, local stories, and most importantly, local audiences with whom those stories will connect to try and find our way forward. Let me give you a couple of experiences from our recent history as a company, what we've been doing. Last year, we premiered a piece called Morpheus, which was an adaptation of the opera Orpheus and Eurydice by Gluck, who is an 18th century composer. The tale is a very simple one of Orpheus going into the underworld to try and regain Eurydice after her death. But we adapted it with the dance company Black Grace and their artistic director, Neil Yeremia. And we've reframed it as a Pacifica set legend in which the same narrative occurs, but it was infused with elements of Pacific dance, Pacific iconography, Pacific costume, and it was populated by an entirely Pacifica cast. For many of our opera-going public, it was a really profound, innovative experience. For us as an opera company, it showed us the power of storytelling when it's owned and wedded to a First Nations Pacifica creator who can truly lead the storytelling of what the opera is. And importantly for us, it doesn't take anything away from the fact that this is an 18th century French opera originally, because it all goes back to the power of the storytelling. So we remain true to the libretto, that is the words. We remain true to the music, although we adapted them for a modern ensemble. And we remain true to the singing lines. The other great example, which some of you may have seen in Wellington recently, was our production of Rossini's Le Cantori, which is an outrageous vaudeville farce, which was first performed in Paris in 1827. It's about rampaging monks, three-in-a-bed shenanigans, all kinds of disguise, frankly outrageous behavior, which was originally present in the libretto for 1827. I think it was a bit hot to handle for most of the 20th century, so it's only in recent years that it's become well known again. And we set it in a South Island health spa with lots of Kiwi colloquialisms in the libretto and the translation. Again, without changing a note of the score and without changing anything fundamental to the libretto, we refashioned it into a contemporary story about privilege, sensuality, and escapism, where no one grows as a person, No one learns anything. It's simply entertainment. So for us, those two operas both have lessons for how we can refashion opera for relevance and connection. I think relevance is a problematic word in many ways. What I'm interested in is connection with audiences. We exist for you. You are our community. We exist to tell stories which capture your hearts and minds, your emotions, and give you an experience which can't be achieved anywhere outside the opera house. That is this magic combination of singing, orchestral beauty, staging, and scale. So they're two brief examples of what opera looks like currently in our company, and also serves as the basis for some of our future thinking. I wanted to move on from that topic about what opera is in general and how we see our role in Aotearoa to talking about accessibility. And I said earlier that they were connected. The reason they're so closely connected is because we are reconsidering who we are as an opera company and what our operating model is as an opera company. So I've talked about European imports before. Traditionally, the model of an opera company is that we serve high European art to the paying public. That is, we put something on, you buy your ticket, you come along, hopefully you enjoy it, and then we'll see you the next time. Actually, we're beginning to think a lot more deeply about what our responsibilities are developmentally for culture in Aotearoa. And if there's only one national opera company, which is us, how do we sustain these conversations and connections with our public so that it's a continuous discussion which goes on not only during our main stage opera seasons, but also in between. For those of you who attended Ori in Wellington, I hope and expect that you received some briefing communications in the weeks and months leading up to your attendance at the performance. This is a part of a new initiative which we've started this year, which we call rehearsing the audience. And the idea is that, of course, the performers turn up fully prepared for their show, but in many ways, audiences are not prepared from the moment when they buy their ticket, maybe 3 months before the performance, to the evening when they arrive at the theatre. And for us, there is a massive chasm there which we wanted to bridge. And that is in preparing audiences for the story, the context around it, so that they're really well prepared for the experience of seeing the show. In the 19th century, the libretti, the texts of the operas, were generally published in very cheap pamphlets and circulated on the streets in the days before the performance. So the audience would turn up fully cognizant of what they're about to see and understanding the text and the story and the context. That kind of resourcing for audiences has fallen away enormously over the past few decades. And for us, we wanted to reconstitute that in order to sustain this conversation. Because in fact, what we've realized is that everything we do is about community. It's not really about professionals performing to a paying audience. It's that the professionals who sing with us are part of our community. That is, many of them in our current year began as young singers in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, elsewhere, and have matured into professionals. But they recognize that they came from young singers being trained in Aotearoa. Likewise, our educational outreach to schools, our opera in schools, and our invitations to schools to come and attend our dress rehearsals also connect with a part of our community. My talking to you today through Age Concern Wellington is a way of us connecting with this part of our community. And similarly, we started a major initiative during our Ori season, which was to provide surtitles for Braille readers. That is, live surtitles, the text of the opera, which is normally displayed above the stage for a sighted audience. But for blind and low vision users, we offer text which is disseminated through the internet in real time, and they can use their Braille keyboard readers to read the surtitles. For Ori, it was particularly important because it was a colloquial translation with lots of laughs, lots of gags, and our blind and low vision users would have been severely disadvantaged by not being able to read the surtitles. So we really wanted to offer them this potential route to enjoyment. I'm delighted to say that those experiments went fantastically well, so much so that we're now going to offer Braille surtitles for every performance of our company going forward, which is a great advance. Normally, surtitles for the blind and low vision community have been available intermittently. There's audio description, but normally audio description has been only offered for one performance a season. In this new structure, this will be offered every night for everything we do. And for us, that's a really important part of the accessibility question, because it means that no segment of the community is disadvantaged through their resourcing. And it's that principle, increasingly, that we're trying to take to every part of our community. So we're currently planning our next season of Rigoletto, which I'm apologetically having to tell you is Auckland only in September, not coming to Wellington on this occasion. But we're launching a major initiative for this production whereby we're planning to offer surtitles in Mandarin to our Chinese community. Now, the Chinese community has never been served with surtitles in their language beforehand. And we became aware that it can be a significant hurdle to enjoyment if you can't understand. And if your own native language is offered, it significantly ups the ante for you in terms of your enjoyment. So there are many initiatives which we're taking concurrently in many different directions at once, because we realize, I like to say something that's a little bit controversial, but I don't think it's untrue. In many ways, the opera business has spent most of the last century doing its best to alienate its audiences. And I mean that they did that through neglect. It wasn't a sin of commission so much as a sin of omission. We thought the audience would always be there. The repertoire would never change. The funding environment would always remain the same. But most importantly, the ecosystem of the kinds of entertainment that were being offered would remain static. That was the biggest miscalculation. We had no conception of streaming, much less LPs, CDs, recordings, TV, Netflix, video games, everything else that people love to do. We didn't include ourselves in that conversation. We simply thought we would be like an eagle's nest up at the heights of culture, offering the very best, and people would simply come along. But the world has changed and is changing much faster than that. So my responsibility as leader of New Zealand Opera is to make sure we keep the pace with the culture around us. And the tension that we're experiencing, which is why I wanted to talk to you about accessibility, is that the disparity between what we're offering and the speed at which society is changing and what society looks for in its entertainment is changing, is becoming wider and wider. If we don't do something to address that, that is simply by catching up. Eventually that gulf, that chain will snap. And we already see the evidence of that in some parts of the operatic firmament around the world. I made my debut in New York about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, for New York City Opera. Now, New York always had the great Metropolitan Opera, but it also had New York City Opera, which was the people's opera since the 1950s. And those two had already existed, always existed side by side. New York City Opera was where the American singers performed, who would go on to perform at the Met, but also it was a sense of this is our local operatic culture, and the Met is the international operatic culture. I actually conducted at the last season of New York City Opera. I don't think it was entirely my fault. It may have been coincidence, but the important thing was that that company folded. And that was an incredible disruption to New York's operatic life, because everyone assumed that there would always be two opera companies in New York. Now there are no longer, there's only one. Exactly the same situation has happened in London currently. There was always the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, and for the last 80 or so years, there was English National Opera. English National Opera fulfilled exactly the same brief as New York City Opera. It was the local singers singing often in English rather than Italian, French, or German. And they discovered the young singers of brilliance who would go on to perform at Covent Garden. English National Opera is now on the brink of dissolution. So it's clear that the operatic landscape is not predictable anymore, but it relies on the vagaries of political funding, but also on changing cultural climates. And so to those who lambast me for not simply being a museum curator, if you like, of the great pieces of the past. I simply point them at all these cultural indications that the climate is changing and that it is no longer optional as to whether we engage. But I'm not doing anything from a trendy or spurious motive. I'm doing it because I passionately believe in the power of opera and in the uniqueness of what opera does, which is couple singing, the human singing voice, to storytelling. If there's no place for that in our culture and in the culture of Aotearoa, then it's a great loss for everyone. And I am currently the responsible person for making sure that this art form is sustained across our nation. So I take these responsibilities incredibly seriously. I also don't underestimate the difficulties in sustainability. And I do say I arrived in this job with a question in my mind. Is opera truly sustainable in New Zealand? Because there have been 2 occasions over the last 20 years where this company, under various different names, has almost ceased to exist. So these risks are ever present. My belief is that the only way that we can regenerate and make truly sustainable opera here, but also across the world, is to connect fully with our communities. That is to move away from a transactional relationship whereby we serve them culture, they give us money. It has to be more multifaceted, richer, and more humane than that, I believe. It's not only idealistic, it's good business practice, because it means that we have many routes through which to connect with our audiences, but also we're creating a narrative, not only for what opera is, but for what is distinctively Kiwi or New Zealand about opera. What kind of opera we can make here that is unique, distinctive, and unrepeatable. So for all of those reasons, and the reason I wanted to really touch on accessibility with you today, it's because accessibility expresses the core of our mission, which is to serve the community of Aotearoa through the medium of opera. In a way, opera is not our end goal, it's the benefits that opera brings to you, the listener, the attendee, the community member. That is the real purpose of what we do. So thank you very much for your attention and time. I hope that's sufficient, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Brad. Fantastic insight into opera in New Zealand. Really, you've raised a whole bunch of interesting questions there and lots of things to think about. First, I do need to apologise because the fire alarm went off. And I know you wouldn't have heard it because of I had the mic muted, but my screen went black because my staff were just telling me that the alarm was going off and we had to go out. So I had to go outside onto the street and leave you alone. I thought I'll just leave him. He'll be talking to everybody. Everything will be fine as long as the internet doesn't turn off. But I was down on the street, so I might ask you some dumb questions that you might have already covered while I was out of the building. So apologies if I ask you a question.
No problem.
Covered. Let me just add myself a spotlight here. Great. Now, just a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question for Brad, pop it in the chat. And there's a little chat button down the bottom, and you can click that and write your question in there. So, Brad, you asked a lot of really fascinating questions about the sustainability of opera in the long term. How is New Zealand Opera going at answering those questions, and do you have a long-term strategic plan in place, or are you working on that at the moment?
That's a great question. I'll start with the strategic plan. Yes, one of the first things I did was develop a 2-page strategic plan, which we're showing and sharing with everyone. There was a kind of strategy beforehand, but it wasn't very focused, I would say. And it was important that the strategic plan, from a management point of view, it's important that you have high-level strategic objectives, that is mission, vision, and values, but that they can flow down into, okay, so what are we doing day to day? And it's really important that those two connect. We can have all kinds of wonderful ambitions for the future of opera, but if they're not made concrete through daily practice, there really is no point. So There are a number of facets to that strategic plan, and we have kicked the tires on it a lot over the last year. We think it's robust and fit for purpose. But that relates to the first part of your question, which is what's the long-term sustainability? It relies on three elements, really. It relies on government support. It relies on community support, that is, whether through bequests or large personal donations or corporate sponsorship. But it also relies on box office. And for each opera company, those three move in different configurations. For instance, my predecessor, Thomas, went to Finnish National Opera, where I think the support from the state is something like 97% of budget. For us, our government support is less than 30% of budget. So there's a big differential in how we're required to source and nourish sustainability financially for the organization. It's a constant challenge, and I spend a lot of my time doing fundraising. But I think the priorities that we've set since I arrived are firstly to get the mission, vision, and values messaging right, so that people understand what we're doing and they feel that it's coherent. Once that stage is achieved, then you can go out doing the ask for support and for funding. But no one gives money to opera anymore just because it's there. We have to advocate for why we're doing it. And that's part of course, what this address is also about. It's all part of my advocacy role for the company.
In terms of that funding model, you sort of around 30%, you said 30% or a third from the government. Does that include city councils? Because I noticed Wellington City Council, Christchurch City Council are supporters as well.
They are. That's a slightly sore point because we get $1.246 million per year from Auckland. We get 70,000 from Wellington City Council, and we get 70,000 from Christchurch. And then there are always a great many complaints about why don't you provide more opera to Wellington? Well, we could do if there was the money to support us, because Auckland gives us that money. Wellington and Christchurch sadly currently don't.
Yeah, I understand that. Our organisation, we work Wellington wide, and we get support, some great support from some areas of the region, but not others. And it does make it harder to work in those other places. Yeah. You are not funded to do that work. So I completely...
Yeah, and also from your principal providers, such as in our case, Auckland City Council, they challenge every bit of provision we do outside Auckland. Why are you doing that? We're giving you the money. Why are you spending money elsewhere? So it's a constant balancing trick for us.
Yeah. So then you've got contributions from the community. What percentage does that make up, donations and bequests?
I don't have those at the top of my head, but I think it works out roughly three-way split. So box office, funding, government.
Yeah. And are you finding that the New Zealand audience is responding really well to Aotearoa driven flavoured opera? Like you talked about some of those ones that have been adapted for our culture?
Yes. Again, great question. I think you can't fool audiences. Audiences have a very, very keen nose for what is modish or fake, and we take a great deal of care to not do that. We've just had the culture counts, which is the survey from audience members for our season of Ori, and it's fair to say that it really divided opinion. The reasons some people absolutely adored it were the same reasons that other people abhorred it. And that's simply life making art. We don't apologize for it, but we do take notice of it. I think when it's sympathetically done and not superficial, and it's in the interests of a deeper connection with who we are, where we are, and what we're doing, it makes sense. But we're not going to apply it across the board just to be Kiwi. Our next production, Rigoletto, has no reference to Aotearoa whatsoever.
How do you select what production you go with, and how long does it take in that process? So Rigoletto, for example, how long has that been planning and learning, I suppose, to actual production performance?
The Rigoletto history is not an ideal one. So I arrived in April last year, and I said, fine, this was April 2023. Opera seasons are normally planned 3 to 5 years in advance. I said, fine, so what's on the board for 24? Yeah, no, nothing as yet.
Oh, yeah.
Mildly freaked out. And then I had to really, really get rushing to try and put a program together in time. I was not expecting that. I thought I'd come into a fully planned 2024 season. So in that case, the timescale for Rigoletto has been pretty much 14 months from selection into performance, which in the opera world is incredibly short. But we've taken an existing production from Opera Australia, which I flew over to see last July, and thought, yes, this is great. We can definitely work with this. It fits the size of our stages. It's a well-known production, but it's also a wonderful production. It was all possible. I could cast it. So there's any number of variables that we're thinking about at the same time. I'm already thinking, obviously, we're just getting approval for our 2025 season now from the board, which is still quite late in the process. I'm running to get further on. But I'm already thinking about what pieces we'll be doing in 26, 27, 28.
Okay. You have a good close relationship with opera in Australia?
I do. I mean, I conducted for Opera Australia as a conductor for many years in the noughties and the teens. So I grew up in Sydney and I'm well connected there. So yes, they are like slightly rougher cousins. And we're grateful for the scale that they offer. They're a very, very active opera company. So it's great that they have so many resources that we can draw on, as in the case of this Rigoletto, an existing production, maintained to a really high standard and ready to go.
In the past, have we traditionally worked together with opera in Australia to co-develop things? Is that something that you might do going forward?
I'd like to. It's a little bit political. There's an existing organisation in Australia called the Opera Conference, and that is all the state regional companies, major state and regional companies, and Opera Australia. They normally put money into a pot each year to create and share a production which tours. Now, there have been discussions in the past about whether we could join that, being across the ditch. It's really a question of the shifting personalities in those jobs and the degree of artistic alignment that we have with them. So at the moment, we have a slightly more arm's length relationship, although the relationships are very cordial, and we will often take opera conference productions. We won't necessarily get in on the ground floor now and put in commissioning money, although that may change in the future.
Okay. Can we talk a bit about talent in New Zealand, opera talent in terms of, talked about casting.
Yeah.
Is there a big pool in New Zealand when you have an opera like Rigoletto to cast, to choose from? How do you foster new talent? What's your role in fostering that new talent?
Yeah, there's no shortage of talent. Of course, most of our cast for Ori were local, that is regional Pacifica or Kiwi artists. For Rigoletto, again, much of the cast is from here. There's a little bit more international presence for that, just to do with the size of the roles and the difficulty of the roles. In terms of future sustainability of artistic talent, yes, we have a young artist development program here in the company, something which went through a small hiatus around my arrival. I didn't really feel that the existing program was fit for purpose in the way that it needed to be. So we've refashioned that and we're just relaunching that now. We have the very generous support of the Freemasons Foundation this year and the Friedlander Foundation to support us with company artists. I'll be going down to Wellington this weekend to see the Lexus final. So we keep our eyes on all the talent coming up. And actually, 2 of the 5 finalists sang with us in Ori. For this week's, 2 of the 5 who've just been announced as the finalists were in our cast for Ori. So there's a very strong connection with the monitoring and the mentoring of that young talent. Of course, artist development is our future. Without artist development, we don't have a future for opera in this country.
Do many, I suppose, go overseas?
Yes, although that's changed somewhat. I think Kiri Takanawa's generation, you really had to make the decision. If you were going to operate at a certain level of success, you had to emigrate. And you basically had to make your life there. Actually, for my generation as well, it's the same. I'm younger than Kiri, but I also went abroad when I was 16 because I was intent on pursuing a musical career. And I stayed there. I stayed in Europe until now, basically. It's no longer the case. I think there's much more of a roundabout rather than a binary choice for young artists. People like Samson Setu and Manasseh Latu, they're constantly going between the States or Europe and here. I mean, I can't even keep track of where they are. So that flexibility about travel, it's no longer either or anymore. And that plays very positively into our hands because we want to keep these connections with artists going. We don't want to feel that they're inaccessible to us, and at the same time that they're accessible to the rest of the world. So the new model is much more flexible and much more positive for everyone, I think.
Can we talk a little bit about the props? You talked about some props. There's a prop room there. I've heard also about a wig room.
Oh, we've got a wig room.
Yeah, tell me about the wig room.
Well, the wig room, we have a whole load of wigs on head masks. Yes, we have a lot of resources here. We used to have our own workshop where we built sets. We don't. That was disposed of about a decade ago, regrettably. But we still have a lot of costumes on site. We also have a lot of sets off-site in containers. When we make a production like Ori, we'll now have gone into storage. It'll be in storage containers. We'll hope that either we will revive it in a few years or another opera company will rent it from us in a co-production framework. So there's a lot of material, if you like, which is involved in the production of an opera, which is not all hire or resale. In fact, we rent out quite a lot of our resources to smaller companies in Aotearoa. We're sharing some of our assets with Wellington Opera for their forthcoming Tosca, for instance. So yeah, it's a circular roundabout, but we do have a lot of stuff here. We also have a big open space. It's a warehouse environment. So we have a big open space where we do our stage rehearsals on site, which is a great advantage.
Understudies. We had a question from one of my team today about understudies. Do you have a whole second cast who learn all the parts? How does that work in case someone gets sick, especially in the time of COVID, I suppose?
Yeah, we don't have a policy of understudies. Our young artists will often understudy a role because it's something that they want to do for their development. And we get requests for understudies. It's slightly complex. We could have understudies who are learning it for their own development, but who we would never put on in the case of an emergency. And they're called study understudies. We could have real understudies who we paid fees to who were ready to go on. But with the length of our seasons and the paucity of our current seasons, it's very, very unlikely that they would go on. So it's not necessarily a good investment. So what actually practically happens is that we don't by and large have understudies, but we always have a mental list of fly-ins. That is, people who we could import from Australia on the day were it to be required. We just need a little bit of notice, obviously, because of the ditch. But that's normally how it works in the business here at the moment. And in Europe, it's also very flexible. Normally, people will get a call. You have to ring it at 1 a.m. on 1 p.m. on the day of a show to say whether you're well enough to perform or not. And in Europe, there's always a rush to the airport at 1:30, whether you're flying from Hamburg to London or vice versa. Singers flying all over the place to jump in without rehearsal at a show that night. It's not quite as frantic here, but it's the same kind of model.
Wow, I never would have thought of that actually. So technically, you could on the day fly someone over from Sydney to plug a gap.
It's happened before. It'll happen again.
Wow, and vice versa. Any of our talent gets.
I'm not familiar with recent history about any of that, but I'm sure it happens. Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. Are there any other questions from anybody? Just pop them in the chat. I think I've asked most of my questions. I love that phrase you talked about, telling story through human voice. Wonderful way to describe opera. You talked a bit about streaming, Netflix, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's changed the landscape. Is there any kind of move for opera to kind of embrace some of that?
Yes, the Met Opera spends over $1 million US dollars a year streaming their productions. There are questions about the success of that. I think once you've heard opera in a theatre, and you realise that you're part of an unrepeatable experience. It's only ever going to be you that night in that room with those people and those voices. There's something a little bit flat and reduced about the streaming experience for opera. I think film's a completely different thing. Film was designed for that kind of consumption. Opera was designed, or at least historic opera, was designed for experience in a real acoustic space. So there are tensions there, but it's certainly a game that everyone's getting in on. And we also have done quite a lot of digital film of opera of our own productions, which we sell abroad to international film festivals. So it happens for sure.
Okay, I'm just looking at the website here. What's the next opportunity for Wellingtonians to see some opera?
Well, it's going to be our 2025 season, which will be announced in October this year. So there's no other production this year after Rigoletto. That's our final main stage. And as I said, unfortunately, it's only Auckland on this occasion. But next year, we are getting ready to unveil the season, and there will be more performances, more productions for everyone across the motu. So we're excited about announcing that.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that. Brad, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. We all really appreciate it. You have some challenges ahead, and it's been a wonderful conversation just to hear some real insights into those challenges that are, we often, I don't have a lot of interaction with opera, but hearing you speak, it's inspiring, and I do want to go along and have a look.
Oh, please do. And it goes for everyone. Please do come along. We exist for you, so we'd love to see your performances. Thank you, Stephen. It's been thoroughly enjoyable.
Excellent. Thanks, Brad. Really appreciate your time again, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for joining us at Curious Conversations. We'll see you next time.